Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's presentation is primarily dealing with the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're going to look a little bit at the life and times of Mikhail Gorbachev. We're going to consider his background. We're going to consider some of the issues that were at hand in the Soviet Union, both socially, politically, and economically during the 1980s, and we're going to look at his efforts to reform the Soviet Union and consider why his reforms don't work, why the Soviet Union dissolves at the beginning of the 1990s. So we're going to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union along with the reform efforts of Mikhail Gorbachev. We're also going to consider the Reagan foreign policy during the 1980s with respect to the Soviet Union. So we're going to take a moment and look at Ronald Reagan's foreign policy with respect to nuclear weapons and engagement with Mikhail Gorbachev during the 1980s. And we'll then consider how dissolution occurs in the early 90s in the Soviet Union, and we'll start thinking a little bit about how this remains relevant to the world today.
So Gorbachev, first of all, Gorbachev he was born a Ukrainian peasant farmer boy, actually. Mikhail Gorbachev did a lot of work on collectivized farms. He graduated with a law degree. He was very smart and a very astute individual, but he very much came up through the ranks. He very much came up sort of from the ground level, if you will, spending much of his teenage years working on collective farms, and like I said, being born into a peasant family in Ukraine. Gorbachev was, as I said, a very, very smart and thinking leader. Gorbachev made his rise through the ranks of the Communist Party in the 1970s. And as you remember from last week's reading from Service, Gorbachev was really one of the only people in the Brezhnev government during the 1970s that could be considered young and a kind of up-and-comer. All the others were, of course, rather nostalgic and older. Not that there's anything wrong with being an older leader, but just that much of Brezhnev's administration was older and not necessarily driven towards reform. Of course, Gorbachev was an example of one who was. And he rose to the ranks during the 1970s and during the early 1980s. During the early 1980s, when Andropov and Chernenko were leading in Russia, Russia was very much beginning to struggle politically in the early 1980s. And when Gorbachev takes power in 1985 as the Congress Party secretary, the Soviet economy was utterly stagnated, and it was largely because of the lack of reform, lack of meaning reforms from the Brezhnev administration or the Brezhnev regime, and also those of the leadership of individuals like Andropov at the beginning of the 1980s. In the beginning of the 1980s, after Brezhnev died, there was a series of weak leaders. Chernenko, Andropov, these leaders were old and in poor health and were not capable of really staying the ship. Well, in 1985, when Gorbachev becomes party secretary, he really begins an intensive campaign to reform the Soviet system. And these were major reforms. Some of them were continuations of ideas presented by Khrushchev. Others were Gorbachev's own. In terms of a cultural thing, Gorbachev hoped to inspire national will through his anti-alcohol campaign. He didn't ban alcohol, but he discouraged it. He made it more difficult to buy. He taxed it more heavily. And it actually cost the Soviet Union a lot of money because the alcohol sales, of course, went to the black market. But Russians liked their vodka. And Gorbachev felt that alcoholism was a very severe problem in Russia. And his anti-alcohol campaign was meant to try to bolster positivity in Russian society, to improve Russian culture. His two major reforms, which were actually published as books, were Perestroika and Glasnost. And perestroika meant restructuring, and this we're talking about the development of socialist self-government, democracy, removal of the Communist Party from complete control over the Soviet Union. So it was the process of democratization and the removal of the party as the ultimate and end-all authority in the Soviet Union. It involved a privatization, the first major effort at privatization since Lenin's new economic policy, in which private businesses were allowed to be established in certain areas and to be involved in foreign investment and foreign trade. It encouraged self-endeavor, initiative, competition, and, like I said, democracy. Glasnost meant openness. And openness in this case meant openness and criticism about Soviet society, self-criticism about leaders in Soviet society. In a lot of ways, Glasnost was a continuation of Khrushchev's ideals of de-Stalinization. Parts of Glasnost were things like greater freedom of speech and freedom of press. Not total freedom of speech and total freedom of press, but greater freedom of speech and freedom of press. And actually, one of the things that would have encouraged Glasnost developing, of course, was the fact that, in 1986, Chernobyl, located in Pripyat, Belarus, melted down. Of course, they had a major nuclear catastrophe in 1986 at the Chernobyl nuclear facility, in which the system melted down, and there was a major release of graphite-laden nuclear particulates that went into the atmosphere and, of course, spread out over particularly Eastern and Northern Europe, and actually affected places as far off as portions of Great Britain. But were particularly high exposures in places like the Scandinavian countries, for example, and in parts of Eastern Europe. Chernobyl's meltdown, the reason I mention this is the catastrophe at Chernobyl, the nuclear catastrophe at Chernobyl, was actually not known in the West for, I believe it was almost a week before the West actually knew about this. And that certainly was a testament to a lack of openness, a lack of openness internationally for the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev will, particularly in the late 80s, begin promoting increasing openness, increasing freedom to journalists, freedom of speech in the Soviet Union, and greater openness in the world about events within the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was influenced greatly by Dubček's Socialism with a Human Face. Dubček was the leader, the Czechoslovakian leader of the Prague Spring, the resistance to the Soviet Union in 1968, who had called for socialism with a human face. And Gorbachev had actually been interviewed and asked, what's the difference between your socialist reforms and those that were proposed in Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring. Of course, the Prague Spring was largely crushed and put down, and really the only result of that period was the separation of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But Gorbachev said that the difference was 19 years, meaning that effectively he was doing the same thing. He was greatly influenced by that example of reform within the Warsaw Pact states, within the Soviet Union. Gorbachev became president of the Soviet Union, the first president of the Soviet Union in 1990, and that was a testament to the fact that Gorbachev was trying to change the way things worked in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was trying to make the Soviet Union he wasn't trying to take it away from being a socialism necessarily, but he was trying to make it less dominated by the Communist Party. And by becoming the president of the Soviet Union, this was effectively an act for him to become, in some respects, a more complete ruler or leader of the Soviet Union, but also one that had moved against complete party authority. So before Gorbachev became party secretary in 1985, the atmosphere between the United States and the Soviet Union had very much intensified in the early 1980s. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was increasing, seemingly. The Reagan administration was increasingly taking a position in which they were not afraid to escalate things in terms of nuclear weapons. The Reagan administration positioned Pershing II missiles in Germany. In 1983, the Reagan administration proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which was a missile defense. It was an idea about a missile defense shield proposed by Reagan, actually proposed by Reagan without really any technical know-how. Reagan was not a kind of policy wonk, okay? Reagan was not the type of guy who understood the ins and outs of every detail of policy. Reagan was, in a lot of ways, a visionary and thought about things in idealistic terms. And for that reason, Reagan oftentimes had ideas about things that were fanciful. They weren't connected closely to reality all the time. And this was largely because Reagan was an ideas man. He was a visionary. He thought about ideal solutions rather than the technical details of them. And SDI was actually inserted into his speech by himself in 1983 as his own idea. And this was the idea of a missile defense shield that would protect the United States in a kind of science fiction almost like way. Which made sense on paper, but the technical aspects of it were hardly worked out, and he had a lot of smart people kind of worried at first when he put that in there. Of course, the Strategic Defense Initiative, some can argue, encouraged an increase in the arms race, which damaged the Soviet economy a little bit further. One might say, to a degree, that might be true, but certainly only if we were talking about the contributions towards the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly only to a relatively minor degree would we say that was really critical. But nonetheless, it was part of an escalation of nuclear tension between the United States and the Soviet Union before Gorbachev became party secretary in 1985. SDI was a violation of the ABM Treaty. The United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s had signed, of course, the SALT Agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, and the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty Agreement. And those two agreements went hand in hand because the idea was if you had the ballistic missile limitation agreements, but you didn't have an anti-ballistic missile agreement, then it would encourage one side or the other to build up huge amounts of nuclear weapons. So SDI, very much from the perspective of many in Russia, was the United States basically violating the ABM treaty. The Reagan administration also conducted a very controversial nuclear weapons test in November of 1983 called the Able-Archer test. Able-Archer was basically a first strike nuclear preparedness test. And it really caused for increasing escalation because the Soviet Union intercepted some of the messages. And at first, leaders in the Soviet Union weren't certain that this was just a test. The Soviet Union actually came relatively close to launching a strike on the United States because it thought Able-Archer was real. At least that's how some historians have understood this. But regardless, this was a period before Gorbachev became party secretary, a period in which nuclear tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were on the rise. In the United States, movies like The Day After was watched, the most watched television air movie in the United States' history. It was watched by over 1 million audiences, and it was a movie about nuclear apocalypse, a nuclear apocalypse that occurred between exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States, but particularly from a Soviet invasion of Germany. Other movies like War Games, of course, of course these are American movies. War Games was another movie that really encapsulated an intense fear in the United States of the threat of nuclear annihilation. as War Games is a film in which the star of the movie, and I remember this when I was a kid, and I'm blanking on the actor's name, but you would know the actor if you saw the actor. But the star of the movie is a computer hacker, and he hacks into this game, this nuclear weapons game, and nearly launches a full-scale thermonuclear war. Gorbachev was really at the forefront of leading the way in nuclear reductions. Gorbachev was really the one, he was most concerned with intermediate range nuclear weapons. And when I say intermediate range nuclear weapons, we're not talking about the weapons that fire from, say, Montana to the other side of the world. Those are intercontinentals. Intermediate nuclear weapons were like the Pershing II missiles that we put in West Germany, or the Soviet SS missiles that were in the SS-22 missiles that were in the East. These are missiles that were designed for regional theater usage. They were missiles that the Soviet Union and the United States had put literally right on their frontiers and aimed them at each other in massive numbers. Both sides have literally thousands of nuclear weapons. Gorbachev is actually the leader when it comes to taking steps to remove those missiles. And he is the one who really, more than anybody else, takes the first step in saying that the Soviet Union was going to pull its missiles out of East Germany. And of course, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, pictured here, signing a very famous agreement, arms agreement. They will together agree to monumental armament reductions and the removal of intermediate range missiles from the entirety of Europe. And these were absolutely tremendously groundbreaking nuclear agreements that by the latter period of the 1980s really ended this kind of fear of nuclear war that had so dominated the first half of the 1980s. Gorbachev also ended the Afghanistan war. He pulled Soviet troops out of Afghanistan and by and large creates a détente with the West and encourages some privatization of the Soviet Union, encourages trade with the West, like private business trade with the West, and actually has figures like Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain saying we can work with Gorbachev, creates a rather cordial and friendly relationship with Ronald Reagan. And even the leader of West Germany. So Gorbachev very much was leading the way in creating a détente with the West, and was at the forefront of helping to end this kind of intense nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, which occurs really between 1989 and 1991, but most earnestly in 1990 and 91, was really the result of the fact that the Soviet Union, which it had almost become forgotten that the Soviet Union was the result of effectively a land-based empire that had brought huge areas under its control after the end of World War II with the formation of the Warsaw Pact. By the late 80s, the economic reforms really didn't work. There were many areas of the Soviet Union that were effectively on war rationing. And to make it worse is not only did you have increasingly dissatisfaction with economic hardship in countries, democratization and the liberalization of social controls unleashed in a profound nationalist resistance that spread throughout the nations under the control of the Soviet Union, particularly in Lithuania, in the Ukraine, and of course in places like Romania, where the Stalinist leader Ceausescu was ultimately overthrown by riotous mobs. For 3 days, Gorbachev was actually overthrown himself in August of 1991 in a coup, a hardline coup. He was ultimately put back in power, but it was far too late. And the last straw was really when the Ukrainian government voted for independence in 1991, and it was one of the last to make the move to vote for independence from Russia. And it was a huge step in the establishment of independent nations out of the wake of the collapse of this long-running landed Soviet empire. Of course, in the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin became president, and the Soviet Union went through, again, great economic hardship. The Russian mafia seemed to become increasingly relevant in Russian society. Russia, as a democracy in the 1990s, experienced difficulty with economic stagnation and lack of political strength. And this helped give rise, of course, ultimately to Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin has managed to really maintain his position in power for the long term. Effectively, though he's been prime minister and president, he's president now. Vladimir Putin, of course, Vladimir Putin has effectively been able to maintain himself in power now for about 15 years. Vladimir Putin had a great deal of nostalgia, or has a great deal of nostalgia for the old Soviet Union. Putin's father fought in World War II. He was connected to his grandfather, connected to the revolution. Vladimir Putin was very much. He was ultimately in the KGB. He was very much kind of a part of the Soviet state, and he has testified that, he has said that he views the collapse of the Soviet Union as one of the most devastating and terrible catastrophes in terms of geopolitics of the 20th century. And Vladimir Putin certainly has implied through his actions recently that he's very much interested in expanding the influence of Russia, in regaining some of the lost territories and lost prestige of the old Soviet Union, particularly with his annexation of the Crimea, and of course, it seems with activity in eastern Ukraine, or at least alleged activity in eastern Ukraine, in trying to help separatists to potentially increase influence in parts of eastern Ukraine. After the fall of the Soviet Union, too, there were other big problems, and this is an important thing to remember about even the Ukraine. Big problems were that many of these satellite states had nuclear weapons, and they had nuclear submarines, and they had this high-tech military technology, and there were big issues with what to do with this technology in the aftermath, and there were many people in the American intelligence sphere that concerned greatly over what would happen with some of the nuclear weapons and nuclear technology that were in these satellite states, these former portions of the Soviet Empire. There were stories of nuclear facilities that were lightly guarded, in which scientists were easily bought off, in which soldiers were easily paid off, and there was great fear of nuclear proliferation in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it were concerns like this that caused George H.W. Bush as president to probably be less than enthusiastic at the news. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but George H.W. Bush, when told of the news of the final dissolution of the Soviet Union, in which Gorbachev effectively declared that his position as president of the Soviet Union had effectively gone into extinction, and that Russia was now its own state, George H.W. Bush was rather he was not jubilant. He was rather concerned, and that was probably one of the reasons. Ukraine and the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Russia actually signed an agreement in which the Russian government under Boris Yeltsin promised to not infringe on the sovereignty of Ukraine if Ukraine would give up all of the nuclear weapons remaining in its territory. And of course it did that. And of course that brought discussion over recent infringements upon Ukrainian territory with the annexation of Crimea, and of course with the rebels that are fighting in eastern Ukraine. Now, of course, the government in Ukraine, the government led by Poroshenko, I think Poroshenko is still the leader, but the government of Ukraine right now is actually a government, of course, that came to power in a coup that overthrew a Russian-leaning leader. And, of course, the new government is, of course, leaning towards NATO and, of course, to the European Union. and the European Union and NATO are very interested, of course, in this. And the United States is very interested in having a Western-looking Ukraine. But, of course, Russia very much looks at the situation and says they would very much like an Eastern-looking Ukraine. They were very upset at the coup that overthrew a more or less, Russian-friendly leader, and this has created some problems. Obviously, from the Russian perspective, as they have seen, from their perspective, they've seen a potential Eastern-looking ally taken from them. In addition, of course, there are aspects of in the Ukraine that are controversial on both sides. Not just the downing of the Malaysian flight last year, but also, of course, the fact that there are government forces fighting in the Ukraine, but there are also pro-Ukrainian government militia groups. And some of these militia groups, like the Azov division, are not affiliated with the government necessarily, but still nonetheless, there are apparently, some groups that affiliate themselves with neo-Nazi movements. And on the other side, of course, there are groups fighting in the rebel areas that very much affiliate themselves with the Soviet Union. And so today you see the Ukraine and Russia very much vying for the position that it will hold in the world. Will it be an Eastern-leaning position? Will it be a Western-leaning position? And of course, we must also remember that oil and natural gas are also a factor in these disputes as well, as Eastern Ukraine and the Crimea are both situated on large oil and natural gas resource areas. Of course, the Black Sea is also an area that the Soviet Union before and the czars before them, and of course Russia is very interested in having strong access to. And so there are long roots, of course, to these conflicts. I mean, the first conflict over the Crimea was fought, of course, in the 1850s between Russia on one side and the British, the French, and the Ottomans on the other, which were all trying to prevent Russia from kind of expanding its access into the area of the Bosphorus Straits and the Dardanelles in Turkey today. So the dissolution of Russia came with a lot of consequences and a lot of problems, from nuclear proliferation to, of course, now a Russia that's potentially resurgent, trying to reestablish, from the perspective of the leader Vladimir Putin, some of its lost nostalgia and lost glory, perhaps. But certainly a Russia that's eager to expand its economic influence in Europe and its control of important natural gas and oil stores. So Vladimir Putin very much has a nostalgia for the Soviet Union and is most likely very eager to expand Russia's influence. But with that said, Vladimir Putin is also most likely going to be very, very pragmatic in the decisions that he makes, as he's a very calculating and appears to be a very calculating leader. But right now, of course, Ukraine is a very concerning place, and the current government in Ukraine has effectively said that an open war with Russia is a very distinct possibility. And of course, the roots of that, if a conflict like that were to occur, and the roots of the conflict now, for that matter, are of course linked to Soviet control of the Ukraine, and of course Ukraine's declaration of independence, or its vote for independence in 1991, and of course now recently Russia's annexation of the Crimea following the coup in February of 2014. So anyway, that's a little background stuff there, and just kind of me running my mouth about that. But of course, we're all aware about what's going on in the Ukraine, so hopefully we read the news and we understand what's happening there, as Russia and the West are effectively vying for which direction Ukraine will look